Alrighty, hopefully everyone's good to go. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Security Compass webinar. Today's webinar will be doing a deep dive on balancing DevOps speed and business risk. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Raquel Rodriguez, the events manager here at Security Compass, and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started with the actual content, I would like to give a quick overview of Security Compass. For those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass was founded in 2004 and began with a team of experienced penetration testers. Today, we have come far and work with many large enterprises globally to manage their cybersecurity risk through balanced development automation. We have three key offerings. Our flagship product, SD Elements, enables organizations to deliver software quickly and reduce costs through automation. Our modular role-based e-learning solutions empower organizations to embrace DevSecOps, and our strategic advisory services offer expertise in cloud security, pen testing, and red teaming for a better security posture. Let's quickly go through some housekeeping items. As you might notice, you have all entered the session on mute to reduce background noise. Second, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording. We will also be publishing this recording in the resources section of our website. Also, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the Q&A chat and we'll address them during the Q&A session. If after our session you'd like to follow up with us or you have a topic you'd like to see covered in a future session, please email us at contact@securitycompass.com. Like I mentioned, for today's webinar, we're doing a deep dive on balancing DevOps speed and business risk. I'm pleased to have here with me Altaz Villani, Director of Insights Research at Security Compass, and Vicki Haley, a Certified Management Consultant. Vicki and Altaz, thank you for being here with me today. I know our audience is keen to hear your presentation, so I will let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Raquel. Appreciate it. And I just wanted to echo, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat window or put them in the Q&A, and we'll be happy to get to those. Before we get going with this, I wanted to afford Vicki an opportunity to introduce herself, a little bit about what she does. So Vicki, if you could take a couple of moments. Thanks.
Thanks, Altaz, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm a certified management consultant, and I've been doing this since probably most people on the call have been before they were born. And I've been mostly doing risk and quality management in the practice, helping software and systems engineering firms, as well as organizations get to a level of security and safety, and that's a hard thing to do. I'm also an ISO lead auditor and instructor of various management system standards like 9001, 27001, so on and so on. I'm also heavily involved in SC42 and the AI work. And I was also on the IEEE committee, as you were, in the DevOps standards. So our interest and experience in this is a long time coming. So thank you.
Wonderful. That's great. Yeah, we've been trying to get Vicki to do a webinar with us for some time. I'm glad we were able to get the opportunity. So this is going to be a highly interactive session. What we're going to do is, let me just quickly bring up a whiteboard here. Let's just kick it off as just as a conversational kind of webinar. And then as we go through this, we're going to fill out this whiteboard. And again, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask those questions as well. So Vicki, when we take a look at how businesses conduct themselves, generally what we see is the priorities for the business tend to be really around things like revenue. Sometimes we'll hear that their focus is on, let's say, cybersecurity compliance. And then we've got a focus as well on regulations. And, if we look at each of these areas, we've got revenue, and then we've kind of got this compliance and regulation space here. So on the revenue side, our focus is on trying to move quickly. So it's about speed. It's about getting to market quickly. It's about getting features out there. And then we've got this other side, which is focused on cybersecurity and regulations, which is really looking at it from the standpoint of how do we go in there and how do we kind of manage our risk, right? And so there's a natural tension that exists between these two. What's been your experience as you've interacted with the industry?
Well, I really like the way you present this because you're actually echoing ancient considerations here of yin and yang, you know, the balance, the push and the pull and the tension. And what we often see is a focus on business and revenue at the expense of the others, except what you really just have to do just to squeak by. I had a CEO tell me that, you know, when all of it falls around me, that's when I'll get my business continuity plan in place. That's when I'll worry about sec DevOps and so on, because right now everything is going great. And that's just a human tendency to stick our head in the sand. But if we don't, then it's obviously a balancing act. And so your title here is appropriate too, because it shows that as soon as one of these gets out of balance, you're now skewed. And that goes for if you shut down too much with security principles and policies and procedures and badges and door locks and you name it, then people can't get to do the work. And similarly, if you don't do that, then you're going to get hacked. And it's just a matter of how much and when. So it's understanding that that balance is absolutely critical. But the challenge is, how do you do that? How do you navigate? Because literally, you're on, especially in DevOps, in the pipelines, you're in a racetrack situation where those guardrails are fairly narrow. And if you don't navigate, you're going to crash. And that's what we see happening when we see security breaches, when we see organizations that haven't told their regulators that the breach was 8 months ago. Those are critical indicators that there isn't control in that organization.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So let me probe a little bit further here. Um, you know, we talk about this tension that exists at the business level, and we're actually going to drill down and get down to the DevOps level. But the question I've got for you at this point, right up at the business level, is who deals with these things? I mean, are we talking about the board? Are we talking about the CEO? Are we talking about the risk teams? Like, talk a little bit about, you know, managing this tension at the business level. Who gets involved with these things?
Well, this is what DevOps brings to the table and why it's taking off is because it involves all of the stakeholders. And so while everybody has various levels of their own responsibility and accountability according to their job description, their RACI chart, so to speak, then basically it's a puzzle piece. You have this system and you have to integrate all of these parts. And unless you recognize that that's what you're doing systems engineering to the organization at that level, then you're going to be missing things. That's where you get situations where security managers are expected to go outside of their role and suddenly they've lost objectivity, where you have all of these problems that are occurring because the right people haven't been identified. So that this takes project management, takes organizational management, human resources input, skills inventories. And so basically what we're starting to see is that in order to get this balance of speed and risk, you need a front end. So the organization needs to achieve all of these things. So consider it's like whatever is easily accessible, you can use it as an input to your risk management, to your sec DevOps, to whatever those inputs are. But if you can't find them, and we know that still in this day and age, 40% of an employee's time is wasted looking for information, even with they're in front of their screens all of the time. If it's not there, they can't act. And so that's given that problem is if we don't give them the information, if you don't front end that work to manage the risk, then you're not enabling the speed. And so where you're managing the risk is right throughout the life cycle and with all of the stakeholders, each doing their part in this system puzzle.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So let me ask you one question then. So we know we want to get all these stakeholders involved. How have you found generally that this process works? Do we all get into a room together? Do we share information? It's hard to get everybody to align at the business level, and that may be contributing to part of the problem. But let's take a step back. Talk a little bit about risk and what you're seeing in terms of risk management and the evolution of risk from a business standpoint.
Yeah, risk used to be in the back office, in the accounting office. What's the financial risk? And that's the only thing that we're going to take a look at. we've evolved, and as if you can see that parallel to the evolution of systems as well, and we're now at the point where we have users developing systems, the interfaces are fairly transparent and so on, and so that whole cycle really has to be considered, in that we have broadened the stakeholder base from when I started in systems engineering in IBM. IBM told the world, this is what the system is and this is how you use it. And you manage your risks according to your business. And it was in the accounting office. These days, risk is everywhere, and it's now reputational risk that is the biggest factor. And so you can lose your reputation for things like you can't meet your speed requirements, or you've come out of compliance, or you have breaches because you're not doing what you're supposed to do. So getting to those stakeholders is the hard part, you're right, because once we understand that anybody can be our stakeholder, it starts to become a prioritization process. That's where risk management comes in. Understanding the ecosystem in which you're operating, understanding the system of systems in that ecosystem, because we all know that products have a global reach. So understanding what the implications are for that, and then doing risk management to understand, identify those stakeholders, and putting in those formal processes to make sure that if the stakeholders are societal, then that means that maybe you have to deal with a consumers group, or maybe there's a town hall if you're a government, and there's some outreach mechanism that you're able to understand that public voice. If your stakeholder group is business to business, then you need to understand the implications of your product on their pipelines and their infrastructure, because then when it comes to managing the risk, it has to flow down through that supply chain. So the context is everything, but risk management is what helps to define what those stakeholders are, and then the context of who those stakeholders are gets defined per organization, per different project, because they will all differ.
That's interesting. And I think what I'd like to add to this as well is when we take a look at the business side, and what are some of the challenges that they're having. We have traditional business models, just in terms of how we're supposed to operate. These are all really evolving, and in a lot of cases, the traditional business models are collapsing. I mean, we're working with competitors now in some cases for a short period of time to gain a competitive advantage together, to increase the market so that we can both benefit. These kinds of things start to come in. So speed and risk is all intertwined with what's happening with the changing business models now as well. So let's kind of dig a little bit deeper on this. And normally when we talk about the business, there's kind of a level below this where we start to talk about some of the ways that a business creates value. And in some contexts, for the sake of argument, we're just going to refer to them as value streams. I know that different organizations refer to different terminology around this, but say with value stream, for example, if you're looking at a business, some critical processes would be things like, let's say, order to cash, right? We might have something else where they might want to go in and they've got a marketing program. So it's marketing to lead gen as an example. Or they might come in and say, we want to go in and we want to take a look at an issue that we found. So it's issue to resolution might be an important thing for them to take a look at. And then underneath all of this, we will map from an IT standpoint, looking at kind of what the IT value streams are, and try to see if we can map the IT value streams to these business value streams that are really important based on revenue, cybersecurity, compliance, and regulations. And so what we have found is usually when we're dealing with IT value streams, we might end up with, and generally from a DevOps standpoint, we'll see something like, let's say, requirements to delivery or requirements to deploy as an example. We might also see from a strategy perspective, there could be a strategy to portfolio discussion. What are the actual applications that we think are going to enable the business? We may also find that there are incidents, cybersecurity incidents that come in. So we're certainly going to have something in here that's a response-based kind of paradigm. So this is, for example, we might have an incident to response kind of model. But we're trying to map what is important to the business in terms of how they need to operate, and look at from an IT standpoint, right? what IT can now do before we even get to DevOps, but looking at how we might be able to map the different value streams and the capabilities in order to align with the business needs. In your discussions, when you speak to stakeholders and you start to cross the bridge between the business and the technical teams, can you talk a little bit about your experience in trying to gradually translate from a higher level and starting to get into the IT space? What are you seeing?
Yeah, that's a challenge because what you're trying to get is two different languages to connect. You're getting to the business value, and let's take SecDevOps as an example, or just the security in general.
Mm-hmm.
You've got your value streams, and we've seen that over the last 20 years. That increase in what security has done to the typical business. It has added huge costs. It has slowed things down. It has put barriers in place in order just to survive because of the security threats, the attacks, the threat vectors and the attack surfaces have become so accessible that unless organizations take these steps to ensure that, hey, where's the risk here and what are we doing to address the unknown unknowns, then they're going to find themselves in a situation where the value has gone down the drain. They've lost that capital because it's been stolen. We've seen that in ransomware. We've seen that in reputation attacks and so on. And so it is a challenge, and it's more challenging now than it ever has been, because this is part of any business model that isn't different. But what is different is the speed. And that is where we're now at the level of velocity, variability. So all of the V's of DevOps are now starting to really present themselves as requirements and manifestations of outcome that have to translate into value if they're going to survive in the marketplace. So when we look at something like security, and we see that we need to inject all of the security procedures throughout the business life cycle. And we have a whole team looking at the dashboard and trying to determine through a multinational global corporation where they need to reroute traffic, where they're needing to enact. And all of this noise is coming in. This is where understanding the context of that business is critical, because in that global multinational, they care about across borders. So having a dashboard that has so much noise, constantly in my audits, I see that they are paying attention to the noise because they're overwhelmed, and the actual potential breaches are being missed through that noise. And so taking that understanding of that ecosystem and then putting in algorithms to create data visualization so that the operators and the monitors can understand that immediately. You can inject the AIs to filter that information. That then facilitates the speed and the value and all of the other aspects that the DevOps team and the overall stakeholder group are trying to do, because that permits the visibility into what is critical, and that then enables them to be able to say, okay, this is how we need to move forward, because we can see very clearly on the dashboard what is the critical parameters that we need to be reacting to. So that's just one example of how to build, and that just goes to that your overall top level diagram, that is a balancing act. So it's going to cost in order to put that data visualization in place. But then, of course, the outcome value is overwhelming when you compare that to the loss of reputation, for example.
Yeah, and therein lies the risk. Now, you talked about the different processes and how we can overlay and eventually create a dashboard. I can't help but sort of jump in here and ask you, where does lean fit into all of this at this point, right? So we're going to create all this stuff. Is it going to require, a lot of effort to do this? Where does continuous improvement come into all of this? A lot of organizations are still struggling with cybersecurity, software security, application security. What's your take on how lean fits into all of this?
Okay, so lean is an approach, right? And irrespective of what the approach is that's being used, an organization has to have the main infrastructure. It's like any municipality. If it doesn't have water, hydro, all of those essential services accessible to its constituents, it's going to fail because
Mm-hmm.
people won't get clean water, people won't be able to do their jobs, they'll get it, it's basically going to be a crumbling. We've seen that in cities where they have had contaminated water in their supply, for example, where the infrastructure collapses. It's the same analogy, the same metaphor in any organization and its objectives. It needs to understand and risk manage that. And so the lean operations is fine. You can do that, or you can do what? You can do different life cycle models. You can operate in a command and control. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that people have accessible the information, the tools, the processes, the policies all have to be in place, because what you're trying to do is get a whole bunch of disparate personalities all to march to the same set of ideals, goals, principles, and contractual obligations, as well as regulatory ones. That requires a full understanding of what those processes are, because you cannot have speed, velocity, variability, all of those things, and the associated vulnerabilities without having controls in place. And those controls are what enables that speed within the guardrails. Those essentially become the guardrails, that infrastructure that is set up, the tools, the training, because what that does is when you say go, that project is launching at a level that is high level of maturity. People are in control. People know what to do. When there's an incident, they can react, and it's not all guesswork. And that takes planning and preparation. Then you're very able to be lean or do any type of model that you want.
Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at the sort of the business and the IT side, and you're trying to bridge the gap here, I have to ask you once again. So who gets involved in this kind of a discussion when we talk about bringing the stakeholders together? It's not at the top level on the business side, but we've got people who are now probably responsible for programs, and we need to start to execute on this, and we've got certain guardrails we need to put in place. So who do we invite into this discussion as we start to integrate what's happening on the technical side with what's happening on the business side?
Well, you mentioned earlier that what you're seeing is problems, and what that is a symptom of is silos colliding with a DevOps environment that is supposed to be high velocity, variability, etc., and all of the V's. That can't work in a siloed environment. So what we're seeing is a flattening of the organizational decision-making processes. Whether or not the organizational structure is flat or not is irrelevant. It's the decision-making model, because think about it, if you're going to get speed, you can't have this going up 15 levels to the CEO for an approval and expect to meet your speed requirements.
Yeah.
So that has to be, again, planned in. So we're flattening the decision-making processes. We're allocating the responsibilities, the authorities, and the decision-making capabilities to the appropriate stakeholders through that risk analysis process that brings in stakeholders as a critical piece of all of this. Risk has to be understood right up front as you're planning and designing that ecosystem. Without doing that, then what you're losing is the ability to understand what those risks are. And that's coming from the stakeholders. So the who to invite is a process that each organization has to go through and understand how can they access who has the most to lose and who has the most to benefit. Because if they can access those outliers, then they already have an idea of who their main population is. This is going to do the precautionary aspect of ensuring that they have looked at risk in a true manner, doing their due diligence to ensure that they've accommodated all of the stakeholder groups that are in that ecosystem.
Yeah, well, wait a minute. That's interesting, because in the past, when we took a look at revenue generation, and then we also went in and took a look at what's happening on the risk side, usually these two were at odds. And so you have to pick one or the other. But I think what you're suggesting is this is unfolding at the level now where risk and speed are, both now. You have to incorporate both. You've got to enable the business, but at the same time, be able to manage the risk from a business standpoint. And we're starting to see the fallout from that kind of a mindset. where the decision making is now much more cross-functional. It's based on risk prioritization, getting different perspectives into this, and you know, we haven't even hit the DevOps space yet. So let me just kind of draw a line here, and you know, that's kind of at the level where we're starting to gradually get into the technical space. But now let's kind of take a look at DevOps teams, right? So usually when we look at DevOps teams, we're generally going to be looking at generally like things like requirements, requirements to deploy as an example. We might also be looking at, we found a bug somewhere in the system. So it's going to be based on issue to resolution in some way. We're also going to go in there and take a look at maybe we had a breach. So we're going to have something around incident to response. And again, I'm very, very at a high level kind of encapsulating what are some of the areas there. This is by no means comprehensive, but you know, this is what the DevOps team now works on. And the goal is to get what they're doing here to align with what's happening up here, which then aligns to what the business is ultimately looking for. So as you interact with DevOps teams, what's been your experience? You know, they're generally looking at requirements. They're looking at an issue tracking system, code. I mean, it seems so far removed from what the business priorities are, let alone even thinking about risk. So talk a little bit about that. How are you now able to bridge the gap between DevOps teams and these business value streams? You talked about cross-functional nature of risk management as we're successively getting now into the technical realm, but now we're at the heart of where software development actually occurs. What are you seeing?
Well, this is where you actually get the stakeholder representatives, obviously not a full room of stakeholders all cheering on what their best requirements should be. But that whole chain of understanding and tracking through to how requirements need to be met. So this is where you're getting collaborative development, collaborative reviews, collaborative monitoring, because remember, there isn't the time to go back and figure this out in the old days of the waterfall. Mm-hmm. These are dynamic. So if a user is requiring a change because if they're in the legal department, for example, and they need a change because the law has just changed and they need it now, there has to be a process for that to happen. And when we say process, people think, oh my God, bureaucracy. We all work in processes. Processes are everywhere. We live and breathe processes, and that's the nature of systems. Systems comprise processes. The key is to be creative and streamline those processes so that they actually achieve their objectives without slowing the process down or sacrificing any other attributes such as integrity. So that's where the business value has to come in, because that's where you get your cost savings, by understanding the true nature and doing what's necessary at that moment. So when we look at the interaction between DevOps and the stakeholder groups, we're not saying, okay, there's that change from legal, we now have to go away and do this huge risk analysis and it's going to take us 6 months. We're changing that. What we're saying is that that's now understood. So now what that legal department is doing is integrating a new set of circumstances, new potential risk sources. The bulk of the work, 99% of that work has already been done. So now this is just integrating a new piece, just like any other aspect of the pipeline. But what that does is it gives a decision-making capability, a whole series of options in terms of, okay, what's the level of risk? And if this is so significant, it needs to go up to the board, then that board is going to be contacted and that risk is going to be managed that way. But what it's doing is it's actually streamlining risk management so at the appropriate decision points, that risk judgment can be reevaluated as necessary, even in a human in the loop, to make sure that it's done. But the rest of it can be automated just as much as the rest of the aspects of the DevOps pipeline.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I was just going to ask you as the next question now, because we're hearing, you know, we had Agile, and then Agile was really focused on trying to meet the needs of the stakeholders. And then DevOps came in and suddenly everything became continuous. There's continuous risk, continuous security, continuous compliance, continuous everything. And, you know, with the appropriate guardrails that you were talking about earlier, you know, you've got to take this and fan it out across each of the different levels. And I'd like to dive a little bit deeper now because ultimately when we start to talk about these kinds of guardrails, we're going to hit the discussion on what's our threshold, but we need to determine what it is that we're measuring initially. So if we could start from the bottom and work our way up now, because we've worked from the top down and looked at how we need to create this alignment, the cross-functional nature of all of this, but can we talk a little bit about, from a security and risk standpoint, some of the metrics that might be useful? It doesn't need to be universal, but the idea is, how do we get into these kinds of conversations and begin to track this so that we know what these guardrails should be and what the tolerance is from a risk standpoint? So from your experience, if you look at the DevOps teams and they're operating from a security and risk perspective, like balancing both of these things, and they're trying to go quickly, what are some of the key metrics that you're seeing that have been useful from a DevOps standpoint? And then we'll work our way up to the business and see how this could roll up into a dashboard.
Sure. And the biggest one always is customer satisfaction. So it doesn't matter what level of the organization is, customers matter. And you can be in a government, it doesn't matter whether or not you're in a for-profit, non-profit. And those are all the key aspects, because that's your process output recipient, essentially. And so when you're a developer, if you're a security analyst, if you're someone who's sitting there making sure that the firewalls are working properly, then you need to understand who your customer is. And that security operator may be looking at a dashboard. They have to have enough of an understanding to be able to recognize what's on that dashboard and its relationship to the business value at that job. So this isn't a board level decision. This isn't a CISO decision. This is the operator at their station, making sure that they understand the implications of their job. And what that means is they need to be trained in that. So that takes organizational understanding of the flow of information, where security fits into that flow, why he's doing that job, why she needs to be monitoring to begin with, and what the implications are if there is a breach, because that requires a whole cascade of events that have to occur, from contacting potential victims of the breach to regulators. And so that kind of communication and understanding of the risk at their level is absolutely a critical piece of this. So it doesn't really matter where that job lays within the organization. And we talk about the bottoms up. The key point is, if everybody knows at that job level what they're doing, then the information can cascade up to the decision makers, the owners of the business, and they're able then to make the decisions accordingly.
Yeah, that's interesting. So everything that we do is essentially focused now on the customer, right? And it's interesting, you know, in the past, I remember, like, we would focus on the technical merits of how good the system is, the availability and things like that. While that's important, where's the customer in all of this? And ultimately, we're looking at the value that we're providing to that end customer, and then working backwards to say, what can we do to provide that to the customer, and then measuring specifically against those things. And then there's a threshold, and therein lies the guardrails. How far are we willing to go before it's like, no, this is going to, you know, really give us an unsatisfied customer, and kind of look at it that way. And I agree, it takes an understanding of the customer. It takes empathy to know what the customer is thinking about. So, you know, there are other tools that are out there, you know, the strategizer model, the customer empathy maps, and things like that that can help us understand and derive what some of these kinds of metrics could be. Now, from your standpoint, trying to get a team that has traditionally focused on code, pushing code out, supporting deployments, into looking at the customer, is this a big gap? Are you seeing a shift? Is there a willingness to start to look at it this way?
Put it this way, it's a reflection of the leadership. So if leadership understands the role and the nature of the customer, and if they're a socially responsible leader, then whether or not they actually have technically the processes in place and it's filtered down, that organization will at least have the potential for that to work well. So it's always a reflection of leadership. But ultimately, it becomes a focus of the organization. And so when I do audits, I often see a whole disconnect between purported goals and objectives and relationships to customers, and then actually delivery, where you see developers being told, just cut the corners, just get it out the door. It doesn't matter what the budget, and being really concerned and especially with engineering responsibilities, concerned about the reliability and integrity of the outputs. And so when you see that, then you have problems in the making. Those are the seeds of it. So this really does show itself in all different facets in the organization, whether or not there's a focus on customers. You can pick up any process within the organization and look at how it's operating within that organization. You'll see whether or not that customer is in focus. So the strong advice is to bring that to the table. So if you're in the bottom level and your leadership needs to understand that, then take that chance and explain the relationship if they don't see it. Otherwise, you're going to run into vulnerabilities of a different kind at the organizational level, and that's at a fundamental customer supplier level, and that's when you get into real trouble.
Yeah, interesting. So when we look at customer satisfaction, bringing that down, each team has a responsibility now to say, what can I do to ensure that we've satisfied the need for that customer, therein providing them some kind of value that they're willing to interact with us. Let's move up a level now and take a look at the teams that sit up just above the technical level, where we see the convergence of the business and technical teams. And generally, this might be like at the program level, for example, in an organization. We've established, a security program or a development program or, a center of excellence. And it's that kind of space where we're trying to do the best that we can. It's not at the lowest levels where the DevOps teams execute, although we feed into that and get feedback from those teams. Can you talk a little bit about customer satisfaction at the program level? How does that translate to the kinds of programs that we need to create? Where do we go in there and get customers and get risk and get speed and kind of see how these interact with each other?
That's where you're getting into the V's, the DevOps V's. So going into something like volume, that will be a specific program requirement. If you're processing big data, for example, what are the security requirements surrounding that big data in terms of the veracity, the integrity, the accuracy? And those become then contextual requirements at the program level that will then help determine how the programs and services are delivered. Another one could be, for example, in SecDevOps, vulnerability. Whatever that, at that level where you have the business value streams, whatever that, it's at the program level that has to determine, this is the value stream, that's one of our V's, but what do we have to do about the vulnerabilities that are inherent in that? And so at the program level, it has to do that balancing, because the value versus the vulnerability becomes a critical aspect. You can give away too much if you're not careful, in your value stream, because you haven't controlled for the vulnerabilities that are leaking information, leaking revenue, and so on. And so all of the V's become paramount in terms of what does that program have to look like. And again, these are all aspects of quality. So it goes back to quality 101 and security, variability, velocity. These are aspects of quality as well in this particular DevOps context.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was having a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation just around, when we look at security and the tie-in between security and quality. So we'll have a security team come in and conduct a threat model, for example, but the question is, okay, what is the value of that threat model? Is it used as a risk assessment technique to go in there and help us better understand how we might offer value ultimately back to our customers? And oftentimes those kinds of discussions are missing. So we create programs, and I think we need to consider how we can align these programs with the actual needs of our customers at the end of the day, and at the same time, trying to make it map to the risk and speed aspects that the business is looking for. And it's interesting, as I observe the industry and I look at the various programs that have been set up, I think one of the challenges I've seen is some organizations will try and take on too much. Uh, and I think, taking a step back and looking at what are the strategic objectives of the business, first of all, do you need to have certain capabilities built into the organization? If not, then you might consider offloading some of that risk to a third party or through insurance, for example. On the other hand, if you need to build up that capability, but you don't have that capability in-house, then you've got to consider what's the risk of trying to build that in-house versus going in and getting some of the like the training or things like that that you were talking about, or doing some kind of an acqui-hire or things like that. So these become really key strategic issues that now play into ultimately the highest levels of the organization, which deal with how are we going to generate revenue but still be able to maintain the risk. And I'd like to see if we can move up now to that highest level where we're dealing now with board members and CEOs and for forward-looking organizations, we'll have a CIO or a chief digital officer at the table and dealing with things at that level. They're definitely concerned about market share, which is a proxy for looking at the way that the customers perceive how the organization is performing. But there are additional pressures now because we've got regulators, which may be a form of a customer that we need to satisfy. Can you talk a little bit about that strategic level and how do we deal with some of the metrics at that level to help us drive this and sort of bring it together?
Well, the good news is that the metric is the same. It's still customer satisfaction. But at that level, clearly there's a whole set of accountabilities that are quite different at any other level. And so you're right that it's that level where they're deciding whether or not they have the core competency and whether or not they need to be able to redeploy resources, whether it should be outsourced or offloaded, because ultimately they're accountable. It's at the top, and that's where the buck stops.
Mm-hmm.
And risk management and accountability has previously, it's not reached the board level. Risk has been a very low level activity where now boards are being held accountable. And that means that those processes for communication, for understanding the risk thresholds, for setting them within policy, and for making sure that the feedback loops to manage the overarching risks are in place. Again, that takes formalization of processes. It doesn't mean bureaucracy, but it does mean that everybody knows their job, what they're supposed to be doing, and the role that they play within protecting those strategic assets. Because ultimately, at the board level, they're looking at reputation as the major asset. The overall accountability for that set of outcomes that that organization has is what would keep them up at night if they're concerned about the future of that organization. So this is a critical place that they and role that they play with respect to setting that tone. And so we're finding that it's much more critical that board members now have an understanding of risk management, of their role within it, because ultimately they are accountable.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there has to be some kind of training happening up here as well, right? And I was going to ask you about this. Many times, we hear, well, that's the business, and they don't really understand what's going on with the technical side. So just leave us alone. We'll do what we need to do. We're in the best position. Otherwise, it's slowing us down. It's not intended to be malicious. It's just trying to focus on speed and getting this thing out the door. But now we've got an accountability, which almost seems like software development is a critical business capability now. And so we've got the people at the highest levels of the organization that need to have some understanding from a risk standpoint in terms of what they're doing with the technology that exists. And, from your perspective, how have you seen this interplay between the business needs and the gap that exists with trying to understand what's happening from a technology standpoint? Are the senior executives becoming more technically savvy? Certainly we're seeing from the regulatory standpoint, they are, and we've spoken to regulators, they're becoming very refined and they're educating themselves on DevOps and Agile and, pipelines and all these kinds of things, and they're putting them into some of the regulations that are coming out. So what does this mean to a business person? Are they taking a step forward to understand the technology now as well?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because legislators are now considering that they will be holding software developers accountable for safety, which means safety, security for all of those outcomes that you typically hold people accountable for with hardware. But
Mhm.
software has gotten a free ride. Oh, it's too complex. It's too abstract. You can never get all the bugs. It's too variable. It's too dynamic, yada, yada. That's changing because especially when we're moving into the domain of AI, and DevOps and AI go quite well together. When you're in that domain, now we're looking at taking humans out of the loop for some of those activities. It's like if you think about AI within a DevOps pipeline, it's like DevOps on steroids, because now you've got a learning model that's now capable of starting to make those decisions. And so that is a dangerous prospect without really strict ethical guardrails. And so the legislators are starting to understand that the capability of AI is now requiring the software developers to be accountable for those outcomes. And that puts the risk squarely on the board at all levels of management and at the individual developer themselves, because we're talking about the complexities of AI, the speed of DevOps, and putting these things together is a recipe for disaster unless it's considered in advance and planned for and risk managed. And again, not bureaucracy, but thoughtful process that then deploys those resources as appropriate to ensure that everybody is accountable for their work and outcome, and ultimately that they're not going to be perpetrating harm on the users out there. So the accountabilities are being built in at the legislative level now.
Yeah, there's so many things that we can talk about here. Just in closing, why don't we talk a little bit about the sort of the standards that are out there, right? We've talked today about risk, and we talked about integrating risk across all parts of the organization. Your perspective may be different, what you're tracking may be different, but the goals are the same. When we look at this emerging model of cross-functionality and a focus on both speed and risk, and we've got security and compliance and all these things built into this, are we looking at completely throwing away like the stuff that people have been doing with ISO 31000 or NIST RMF? Can you talk about that? How is there a gap? Can we leverage what's there to still continue to move this as the next stage of how we need to evolve from a risk perspective?
That's interesting because any kind of building or evolution depends on a stable platform. So this isn't any different. All of the software and systems engineering standards that are out there provide a basis for understanding the basics of process. They're just redeployed. They're just done in a different way according to different parameters, like velocity, for example. So the basis is the same. It's like everything in physics is basically the same. The laws are there. It's just a matter of the infinite variety that you can manipulate those laws to get an outcome. That's what we're seeing here, especially in the evolution of, the V's, the velocity, the variety, the volume of data. The big data aspects of those are creating new opportunities. So what that means is that the guardrails are in place for a reason, because we know that there are going to be unknown risks. So what this does is it just sets up an infrastructure in order to enable that progress and that evolution to occur, and keep those accountable individuals within the organization, those teams, out of the law courts, because ultimately it provides the structure, the set of controls, the verifications, the sign-offs that show that due diligence has been done.
Yeah, and you mentioned just very briefly, looking at the product side of things as well, and with the whole IIoT now kicking in, and even looking at the convergence of hardware and software now, the things that we have talked about, DevOps now including things that are in the IoT space. Does it negate any of the stuff we talked about? Are there new use cases that we have to consider from a risk standpoint, or is it still the same strategy, the same methodology to help us drive out speed and risk and security?
Well, I think that goes to an overall approach, and that is to recognize that change is the constant, that everything is dynamic, and so risk is an iterative process. So risk is overlaid onto everything we do. We're natural risk managers. That's how we survive. This is just formalizing it so that individuals can collaborate in that risk management and making sure that everybody understands. So again, basing on the current principles, those are time tested. What's different is how they're applied. How do you get teams in place that's different because now you have larger stakeholder groups and so on. So we're building on a base of stability in order to adapt to the new realities that we're facing with our customers.
That's wonderful. That's great. And with that, I'd like to bring the webinar to a close. I think we have at least 2 or 3 other full 1-hour webinars that we can probably talk. But I'd like to hand it off to Raquel at this point to bring us to a land. If there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again for another great webinar. We did have a few questions that came in. The first one here is, are there any standards that address software development and business risk?
Vicky, you want to talk about the standard side?
Sure. 16085 is an ISO IEEE standard that outlines the risk process specifically for software and systems engineering, and it's based on ISO 31000. And 31000 is the guidance document for how to set up a risk framework, risk processes, risk management, so risk identification, analysis and treatment and so on, and then monitoring in that full cycle. And so 16085 is the software development application for that.
Perfect. And the next question that we have here is, can you talk a bit about how to scale out a program across different organizations, which incorporates both business risk and software development?
Yeah, I think we touched a little bit on this, didn't have a chance to really go deep into it, but it touches on, for example, partnerships and the supply chain. How do you create a program that enables you to go in there and now scale across different organizations? So I'll talk a little bit about what I'm seeing, and then Vicky, you're welcome to chime in as well. Usually there are certain policies that are put in place that you need to track against. One of the challenges we've seen in the past is a lot of supply chain activities were really done through self-attestation, and that's a problem. For a supplier to come back and say, yes, trust us, we are doing this, isn't actually good enough at this point. We need to be able to go in and be able to view the kinds of reports that we would expect internally as well. And so that from a quality standpoint, everybody has to be at the same page in terms of being able to go and manage the risk and being able to go and look at speed and so on and so forth. So one of the challenges that I've seen is sometimes when we, for example, take a look at cloud providers, and you're using a cloud provider as part of your supply chain from a technology standpoint, how do you go in there and audit a large cloud provider? Thankfully, what they're doing is they are producing things like SOC reports, which you can use as a mechanism to build some assurance into what you're trying to build as well. So I'll just pause there and Vicky, give you a chance to respond as well.
Thank you. I think one of the biggest challenges in creating a program through, whether it's through outsourcing or through supply chain, is getting your particular risks understood by that supply chain. So if you remember, we had that balancing act in terms of, the yin and the yang. That's really a critical piece of this, because on the one hand, you need to collaborate with your supply chain to bring them into your bubble to make sure that they understand your risks and what you're trying to protect and your threshold so that they never exceed them. And at the same time, the other side of it is you need to have an arm's length relationship and be able to audit them, as Altaz was saying, to be able to do verification and evidence-based audits that your assets are actually being protected the way they've promised to do so. So again, you're getting that balancing, that tension. But if you don't invite them into the relationship for them to understand how important your requirements are and what it means in terms of your loss potential, they're not going to get it because they're just going to assume you're like every other client. That's difficult to do with the bigger vendors, but you can still put those types of requirements into your contracts, or if you assume those risks yourself, then you have an action plan that enables you to manage it yourself.
Awesome. And then the last question that we have here is, how much of a Blanche development approach can be automated?
Sorry, Raquel, how much of what was that question again?
It says here, a Blanche development approach can be automated.
So like a vanilla, I think is what's meant, like a vanilla approach.
Okay. Vicky, you want to take a look at that?
Sure. I would say that it's pretty much the 80-20 rule. You're going to have some human interventions there, but and I think it's going to evolve to that 80-20, and if you're really optimized, even higher. But count on about 50-50 as you're getting to that level of automation, because what you need to do, one of the most critical aspects is having your risks identified. And so building that risk register, the risk databases, the connections with the stakeholders, that takes the time up front in planning. Once you do that, all of that set of knowns and known unknowns can be registered and then automated. It's then that 20% can manage the things that are emerging that no one ever thought about before and still have control over the pipeline.
So I'd just like to add, it is going to be contextual. If you start off with something that is kind of vanilla and overlay it on top, it gives you like a compass and a set of guidelines on how you can move forward. But eventually you're going to hit something that is going to be context specific. And again, if the intent is to try and scale this and try to create as simple and generic a model as possible, to Vicky's point, I concur. I think you start off with something that can do that, but just keep in mind that there will be things in there eventually that you're going to have to contextualize. How are we going to deal with our suppliers specifically? How are we going to make sure that the DevOps teams are producing output that is within the guardrails of what we're looking for? And these things can change over time. In a world where it's continuous everything, you know, imagine having one supplier today and then tomorrow you shift and now you're connected to a totally different supplier. Your risk profile has changed. What are you going to do as a result of something like that? So I think I wouldn't view risk as being something vanilla in the sense of being static over time. You can certainly look at that initially, but then as you evolve, then there has to be a continual improvement model to try and make sure it aligns with the business, because at the end of the day, the goal is to enable the business while managing the risk at the same time. So anyway, I'll just pause there, and Raquel, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. So that was actually it for the questions that we had come in. I just wanted to say once again, thank you so much, Altaz and Vicky. That was a great session. And for everyone that's attended, we do have webinars lined up for the next few weeks. So if you are interested in attending any of those, please go to the upcoming events and webinar section of our website to sign up. I also wanted to mention that we just recently launched our podcast. It is called The Balancing Act, and you can find us on all podcast platforms. We hope everyone found this presentation insightful. And again, we'll be providing a link to this webinar to everyone here via email. Thank you again for attending. Stay well and safe and have a great day.